Well, this camera malfunction caused me to have to redo this video. Don't worry about that. I can handle it. The tools and miscellaneous repair thoughts here. I was talking about this rusty post on this coil. Basically, this one here wasn't and that one is. And I've talked about this before, but this demonstrates it really well. It gives you a comparison between one that's got a plug wire that's got naked spark happening inside of it. And it traps the ozone. And what happens is whenever the ozone gets trapped, it winds up corroding this because that ozone is very, very corrosive. All right, this right here is a leaking hydro boost that we had on a Chevy truck. These hydro boosts don't typically do a lot of this, but they put these hydro boost units on the vehicles that don't have room for a booster under the hood, or they don't make engine vacuum like a lot of your diesels don't, that kind of thing. This one here wasn't a diesel, but it had a hydro boost on it. Mustangs sometimes will have a hydro boost unit on it because they don't have room for the great big brake booster under the hood, and the booster needs to be big because atmospheric pressure needs to operate on that diaphragm and give you the power boost you need. This right here was a water pump that was put on by a newbie that told me he was all done. I thought he got through pretty quick, but he didn't pour any coolant in it. The next day when we started pouring coolant in it, it started running out all over the place. And whenever I saw where it was coming from, I got my camera down there and put a light on it and took a picture of it. And so I put that on the wall as an example of how best not to install a water pump. You can see how wavy the gasket is. And I don't know if he had something in the bottom of one of the bolt holes that kept him from tightening it all the way up or whatever, but that is something that needs to be considered, because if you have something like some silicone that somebody had from a previous gasket or something that's crammed into the bottom of a bolt hole, it'll keep it from pulling tight. This water pump right here had come apart, and the strange thing about that water pump situation was that truck that was a 4.2 liter and a 07 F-150, I'm not a 07, a 97 F-150, that thing would run really, really cool, like 200 degrees. I say that's pretty cool. Let's run normal temperature, sitting in the service bay idling. But as soon as you backed it out, before you even went 40 yards from the door, you were going into the hot range really, really, really fast. So as soon as you started to drive away, it would overheat. But when you were sitting still, it wouldn't. And I never would have figured that a water pump that had lost its impeller would cause a problem like that, and I can't tell you exactly why that was. There was another strange one that we had, was on a 99 Ranger that had about 900,000 miles on it, and I'm not kidding about that either. The guy kept a logbook because he actually was a truck that traveled with 18-wheelers that were hauling stuff, and he couldn't get any cabin heat. And we worked on the thing. We even put a head gasket on it just for the sake of argument, water pump, thermostat, you name it, all that kind of stuff, checked all the coolant flow and everything. And one of the things that I thought was really funny was that the only way we could get that guy any cabin heat was to take some of this corrugated plastic board and drill some 2-inch holes in it, randomly, and put it in front of the radiator, and that would warm it up. But I looked up online, and it seemed like a lot of people were having issues with that. That was one I never really figured out. Of course, we didn't have a whole lot of time to work on it either. But at the same time, that, how does an engine not make heat? It started out making heat, and all of a sudden it's not making heat, not overheating, running too cold all the time. It's the weirdest thing I've seen in a long time. Some of you guys may have the answer for this. Let me know if you do. This 2006 Impala was built Coolant Sludge. Some people say it's because it had Dex Cool in it or whatever. But the smart thing people can do is replace their coolant regularly according to the manufacturer's specifications. And if you always do that, you won't have a cooling system gets all clogged up with this sludgy mess right here. We worked on this lady's vehicle. We kept having to come, reflush it. And finally we replaced the radiator and managed to flush enough of that junk out of the block to where it stopped clogging things up. It was a nasty mess. That was on a 06 Impala right there. All right, what do you see here? What we had here, if you notice, at wide open throttle, TP voltage 4.29, we had a mass airflow that was topping out at 3.76. It wouldn't go past that. We unplugged the mass airflow sensor. It would run really, really well. I saw Pontiac Aztec doing exactly the same thing for exactly the same reason, only it would only read about half. At least this was reading about 3/4, but the long and the short of it was that was a mass airflow sensor. Somebody had replaced the engine in this vehicle, and after they drove it, it just didn't run quite right. I don't think the people that put the engine in it caused this problem. But the simple fact is that mass airflow sensor was bad. And I kind of like looking at voltage. You know, you can look at how many grams per second and all that kind of stuff if you want to. But on the Fords, particularly the older ones, I always like to look at the voltage of the map sensor. A lot of the General Motors map sensors would read in hertz. And one time I was working on an old GM car, and it had a mass airflow sensor code, and I determined that the mass airflow sensor needed replaced, and I popped another mass airflow sensor on there, and that code would not go away in spite of the fact that the car seemed to run okay. And so just for grins, I took it down to the Chevrolet place where this Randy, this friend of mine, worked down there, and we looked and measured all of the readings that the mass airflow sensor was putting out, and everything was within specs according to the GM book, but it still had a code on. And so the guy told me, he said, the only thing I can come up with is it doesn't like this mass airflow sensor because it was a white box part, and it was. And so I got a Delco mass airflow sensor put on there, straighten that right out. I used to have Motorcraft ignition modules that I would need to replace a aftermarket thick film ignition module on some of your older Fords that still had distributors. I'd have to replace that module. If one came in not running right, and that module was an aftermarket module, the first thing I would do is jerk that aftermarket module off and put a Motorcraft module on it. A lot of times it'd fix that. Same way with Bosch spark plugs. Those Bosch fancy platinum spark plugs with Bosch Platinums, people would put those in those Ford cars, and they'd come in and it wouldn't be running quite right. And the first thing I do is jerk those Bosch spark plugs out of there and put regular Motorcraft plugs in it, and I fixed a lot of them like that. And so sometimes the aftermarket stuff just not quite the spec that it ought to be, and it's not anything you can really put your finger on. It's just that it doesn't quite work right. This right here was a magnet that came off of the crank sensor and stuck to this. We got a crazy signal on this one here. It was a no start. The guy put a timing belt on it. He bought the vehicle. It was a Dodge Stealth. It was an 94 model, and he bought it with bent valves because it had jump time. Well, we pulled the heads off of it, fixed the valves, put it all back together. He put the timing belts back on it, and it wouldn't start. And we scoped the chem and the crank sensors, and I don't remember where the scope pattern is now because I've since lost it. But it didn't look at all like it was supposed to, although it was very regular, which was very strange until we pulled it off and we found this magnet from the old crank sensor stuck to we had replaced the crank sensor, but there was this piece of a magnet that was stuck to one of these vanes, and it made a very regular square wave pattern that made no sense at all when we compared it to what it was supposed to look like. Now this vehicle here is very interesting. This one broke down. That guy was sitting in it with the door open and the hood open on April 16th, 2022, but on May 11th, well, even this morning I went over there, which is the 16th, I went over there and that same car is sitting in that same spot. Now it's a Chrysler Sebring convertible, which typically those will have that 2.7 liter V6 that everybody absolutely despises because you about got to pull the motor out to put a water pump on it and stuff like that, And there's a lot of known problems with those engines and all that. And they run pretty good when they're running, but the thing about it is, I've had written an article about one of them in Motor Age one time. I had these people writing to me said that they would just cry when one of those came into the shop because they absolutely hated working on them. Anyway, that one there broke down, and I always wonder what happened. This guy pulled into that parking place and parked in there, and whenever he got ready to leave, and this was in the morning too, as I remember, when he got ready to leave, that thing apparently wouldn't start for some reason or another, and it's still sitting there even right now. It's a nice looking car, This one right here, I just had to stop and take a picture of it. This is a 65 Pontiac Wagon. It was just beautiful, the way that the thing was all. I don't know if they found it in a barn and polished it up and got it running. I don't know if they restored it. I always wonder about these kinds of things, but that's a station wagon. And it's just cool as all get out because you don't see a lot of station wagons anymore anyway, not like this. And furthermore, that one right there, think about that, 1965 was a long time ago, and that's when that car was new. You ever use a dial indicator to measure crankshaft in play? I used to teach my students to do that. We had some trucks for a while over at the Ford place that, or it wasn't some trucks, it was one truck that kept wiping out thrust bearings on the crankshaft. And as I remember, there was something wrong with the torque converter on that one because it would swell up too much when it got pressure on the inside of it. It was pushing forward on the crankshaft, and it kept wiping out those thrust bearings on the crankshaft, and they went up and put a torque converter in to straighten that one out. Now, why that torque converter was swelling up, good gracious, those things are thick. You pick up a torque converter as heavy as all get out, try to cut into one, you find out how thick they are. But that one there was basically pushing forward on the crankshaft a whole lot. All right, this particular one is basically a lateral run out. You'd be surprised if you've been in the business a long time, you've seen this. I had one of these, and I could, slap that and spin it. And I took a video of it, and it was sitting there doing this while it was spinning. But anyway, I was teaching the students to check the run out on these hubs, because the run out on that hub is really important. I don't know if somebody slides up against something, hits a pothole. I don't know what bends those things, but sometimes they bend and they start wobbling like that. And if they got too much lateral run out, you're going to basically have brake noises and other kind of issues like that. Now, I would also teach my students how to check backlash on rear ends. And you would basically take the shims from over here, and you'd start out the way that Ford and Chevrolet said to do back in the day, is you would start out by getting the shims that were just where you could push them in there with your thumb. And then you would basically, whenever you were setting your backlash, moving your ring gear, if your backlash was not enough, that's how much goes clunk, 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 clunk between the gears. If the backlash was not enough, you'd move the ring gear away from in other words, you'd move it that way to get more backlash, and you'd have to put a thicker shim over here and a thinner shim right here. And if you wanted to move it the other way, you'd actually put a thicker one here and a thinner. But that's the total of the two shims was always supposed to be, the same. You just have to subtract and add from one side to the other. When it was all over with, and you wanted to set your preload on your bearings, you had to add 4 to 6 thousandths to each one of the shims that you were using, and you had to knock those things in there to give those bearings a nice solid preload, because the preload on these bearings and also on the pinion bearing are really, really, really important. Because if those gears are wobbling around a little bit, it'll basically whine and sing and all that, and it'll mismatch those gears in an incredibly ugly way. And if the gears are mismatched, they'll be noisy. No matter how good they look, they can still be noisy if they're mismatched. And I remember I told you about this one guy that had a noisy rear end in one of those big trucks back there when he worked in a big truck shop. And he put that thing up on stands, and he smeared a valve grinding compound all over the gears with the cover off of it, and just let it idle all day and gear running. And he cleaned all that valve grinding compound off those things, and he had matched and lapped those gears to each other using valve grinding compound. Now, don't try this at home, but it worked for him. It was just smooth as silk when he got through. He was an old guy that always sometimes he'd come to work 2 days in a row with the same spot of grease on his nose. I don't even know if he took a bath, but he was a really good old mechanic. This one here was a 4.8 liter that we were measuring the valve lift. You put it on top of that push rod, and you put it on 0, and you turn bar that engine over and see how much valve lift you got. We found out that one right there, if I remember right. Well, this guy said it was running bad. He really didn't know why. It just didn't seem like it felt right. I drove it, and I couldn't, determine that there was really anything that I could find wrong with it. But I knew that guy wasn't a dummy, and he was telling me it just doesn't feel right like it used to. It really bothered him. And so I said, okay, so what we need to do is we need to start checking this. One of my students, it was pretty sharp, he said, I'm hearing a little bit of valve lifter activity up under that hood or loose rocker arm or something. He heard it, click, 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 click. Every time he'd hear that, and that lifter was trying to pump up. But it turned out that particular cam lobe on that cylinder was actually worn, had about 30 thousandths or something worn off of it. It was supposed to have like 241 thousandths of lift, and it only had like 210 or something like that. And it turned out, I told him, I said, we can tear this thing down, we can put a camshaft in it, we can put you some new lifters and all that kind of stuff. The truck belonged to the college anyway. But you can put a plug and play the engine that's the 4.8, the 5.3, and the 6.0 on this, 200, 2000, the ones that have that engine in it, that's just the base engine, and I'm not talking about all this cylinder dropping stuff and all that. This is a plug and play thing. If you got a 4.8 and you want to put a 5.3 or a 6.0 in there, you can just pop it in there and plug everything in, and you don't have to pre-program nothing or anything else. You can just go to town with that. Well, we took this 4.8 out of here, and from LKQ, they're the ones that told me that. We got a engine that was a 5.3, and we plugged that one in there, and that guy drove that thing, and his secretary rear-ended a truck with a bunch of logs on it or something and totaled it out. She didn't get hurt, but she destroyed the truck, which was kind of a shame because the truck ran really, really good with that 5.3 in it. Anyway, this one here, this is when I was doing an upgrade on that one. We upgraded the 4.8 to a 5.3. You know, basically I got this little bar down here and I bolted that in place, and so we could get a nice even lift straight out of there. You know, I mean, just coming. We pull the transmission out first, and then we raise this up. That's Robert. He was the guy that did this job, and we used the electric hoist to raise that thing out of there just real nice and straight. And that worked really good if you've got one of those electric hoists where you just mash the button and it raises up, because you know everything is so controlled. Everything when you're jacking it up with a cherry picker, it's a little bit more difficult. But we swapped that one out. We popped a different motor in it, and that thing ran really, really good. That's actually the one that I was talking about a minute ago. All right. Now this was a 2020 Corolla 20P0128 permanent code that it was set in the scan tool permanent code. My son's vehicle, he drives this. Incidentally, he works at the Toyota plant too, but he doesn't build cars. He actually keeps their equipment going. He does facilities maintenance. And so he basically got this thing, the electric thermostat. This right here, you plug that in and it heats up the element in the thermostat. And the engine controller is going to control when the thermostat opens when it wants to. But if this part fails, the electric heater element, it'll operate like a regular thermostat. It's pretty ingenious the way they did that. The problem is, finding this thing was very, very, very hard. None of your aftermarket suppliers have it. Toyota had it. They had 14 of them in Jacksonville. And so he managed to order that, and I think he wound up paying $85 for it. But the thermostat is built into that housing, and that's the way that thing looks. That was a lot of fun right there, having to fool with all of that. But anyway, and the MotoLogic showed every one of these 2-liter Corollas having this little bleeder here and this pressure tank on it. Well, this one right here has got a radiator cap out here. The actual car has got the radiator cap here, and it's got a little surge tank here. This truck car here in this configuration with the cooling system does not show up anywhere in MotoLogic. And you know, I don't presently have access to all data right now. I used to, but I don't now. But I can get to MotoLogic, and that's what I found right there. All right, this is my friend's wife's truck, contagious skipping. 2013 EcoBoost, needed 2 coils and all 6 plugs. Well, that was a crummy deal. My same friend, his personal truck, he was crowing about how his Chevrolet never gave any trouble, never did any skipping, had over 200,000 miles on it. Right after they got his truck fixed, her truck fixed, his truck started skipping the same way, and it had to have all the plugs in one coil. And so he had to have number 8 is what it was. My personal F-150, after I talked to him on the phone about both of these other ones, mine started skipping. And I said, well, I guess this is all contagious, you know. Every time somebody called me about a skipping truck, it was going to bleed over into mine. So I went ahead and put mine, you know, I had to have one, the coil pack, you know, it's basically on the, and you saw the video I made about that, but anyway, that was what I did on that. And I used my scan tool and all that kind of thing. This right here is an easy to find plug wire breach. You can pull that plug out if you got those down in the well like that, and it'll pop out the side if you got a bad wire. That's what happens when you got to skip on one of those. I enjoy doing that on one of those. It worked really, really good to find one like that. And we can look at that video again, see how it's popping out the side. And that was a really common thing to find on those kind of like that. After we pulled the cylinder head on this vehicle we were working on, we noticed that somebody hadn't screwed one of the plugs all the way in. Now sometimes that burns the plug up like you hit it with a torch, because the heat's supposed to be conducted out where this is seated. You notice that never was seated, but apparently there was enough heat being conducted out of the threads where it didn't burn this up, or that engine didn't run as hot as some of the 4-cylinders I've seen. There's one student of mine just threw a plug down in the hole. You know, you don't do that. Get a hose and go down in there with it so you can start it and go as far as you can. And some of them knotheads, when you weren't looking, if they didn't have good training, they would just throw the plug down in the hole and just hope it would be all right when they started it. Well, if they ding the first thread, now they've got a big problem. And so they cram it down in there as far as they can, hope it'll be all right. But we had one that was a 4-cylinder, had to fix the threads in the head, but the guy got it in there a crooked part of the way, and it kind of burned the spark plug up. I had a picture of that on a different one. This one, for some reason, didn't overheat the spark plug like they usually do, but he drove a long time. You can look at them threads and tell with that thing not in there. You also see all this in here that you see was antifreeze. When you see this kind of stuff in there, it's typically antifreeze that is cooked onto that thing right there. Why is my fan noisy? This is one that we had found that was noisy. We cleaned that crud out of it and smoothed it up. You know, that fan's got to be balanced, and anything that causes it to be unbalanced is going to cause it to jiggle and wiggle. My lunch partner, Alan, he actually, his wife's car had a shaking dash when you turn on the fan. We pulled the fan out of that, and it had to look like a dish rag that had been put in bleach until it came apart or something like that, and it was all down in there. She didn't remember putting a rag on the dash or anything. It's always been a mystery where that came from. That's going to be a sort of a quick run of what I did last time. I hope I got sound on this video, and I thank you guys for being patient. I'll talk to you guys next time.